Quo vadis, smart mix? This is the question that we want to ask in this breakout session with a particular focus on relevant developments in the field of mandatory human rights due diligence in the EU and in Germany. My name is Laura Kurze. I manage the Human Rights Program here at Global Compact Network Germany, and I'm very happy to be welcoming you all for this breakout session at the United Nations Global Compact Virtual Leaders Summit. So we did have a plenary session earlier today to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And if we look back at those 10 years, one key development, certainly here in Europe, has been the increasing momentum for mandatory human rights due diligence frameworks, and also the growing body of law that seeks to translate responsible business conduct into specific legal requirements. The German government, for instance, as some of you might be aware of, has agreed on a law that, if passed in parliament, would require certain German companies to effectively address their human rights risks from 2023 onwards. And the European Commission, too, has announced plans for a legal initiative on sustainable corporate governance, including human rights and environmental due diligence standards. While this is, of course, an important step towards the implementation of the UNGPs and welcomed by many stakeholders, including some companies as helping to both raise the bar but also level the playing field, it also really underlines the importance of giving some thought to the broader implications in terms of the smart mix of measures that we hear a lot of talking about and that the UNGPs call for with regard to effectively implementing the protect, respect and remedy framework. So including both mandatory and voluntary measures at national and international level. And I'm really, really pleased to have an excellent panel of speakers with me today who will be providing their perspectives on these questions and which I very much look forward to discussing with over the next 45 minutes. I'll introduce you in turn. Let me start with Anousheh Vahidi, your head of division for policy on sustainability in global supply chains, as well as Commissioner for Sustainability Standards at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. A lawyer by training, Anousheh Vahidi has been a vocal advocate for the smart mix and led the ministry's activities in the context of the monitoring of the German National Action Plan on business and human rights. Importantly, she's also played a central role in the development of the key aspects of the planned due diligence legislation in Germany, and I'm sure she'll be able to tell us a bit more about it in a second, while she's also been accompanying developments in this regard at EU and United Nations level. So speaking of the EU level, I'm very pleased that we have Lucrezia Busa with us. She is member of Cabinet of Commissioner for Justice, Didier Reynders, at the European Commission. Her responsibilities include topics such as the digital agenda, contract and company law, as well as legal affairs more broadly. And as some of the in the audience will be aware, it is in fact Commissioner Reynders who, of course, announced the European Commission's plans on binding standards for environmental and human rights due diligence last year. So it's a great opportunity to be able to hear from you today about these plans in some more detail. And next up, we have Frances West, who is Business Engagement Director at Shift, the leading center of expertise on the UNGPs and an organization that really focuses on putting the principles into practice. So both with regard to the policy, but also the corporate level. And Frances oversees Shift's work in providing expert advice to a select group of companies that are serious about addressing their human rights impacts. But these days, I hear actually that much of your time is focused on Shift's work on mandatory human rights due diligence at the EU level in particular. So great to have you with us and hear your insights from that work. And finally, very pleased to welcome Thorsten Pinkepank, who is Director for Corporate Sustainability Relations at Chemicals Multinational BASF, and thus someone with extensive first-hand experience in implementing what we're talking about in terms of sustainable business practices, including human rights due diligence. Having been with BASF since 2002, he has held a variety of positions within the company before taking over responsibility for BASF's corporate sustainability relation. I should also mention that Thorsten is currently the chairman of the board of Global Compact Network Germany, as well as a member of the expert network of the United Nations Global Compact. Great. So with all of you here, let's not lose any of our precious time that we have. And I would like to turn to you, Anousheh Vahidi, first. Now, it's fair to say that there has been quite a bit of discussion around mandatory human rights due diligence in Germany over the past months and probably years. Would you be able to give us a brief overview of what's planned in terms of due diligence legislation and perhaps also reflect on where we are at from your point of view, more broadly with regard to a smart mix and what the key challenges are that you think still remain?
Yes, thank you very much, Laura, and the panelists, and thank you very much for the invitation and having us here to share our perspectives on the smart mix. So let me summarize it for us. We achieved a lot in Germany when it comes to a smart mix of measures, but still there is a long way to go. So as you might know, voluntary measures dominated the arena in Germany in the past years. And we offered a variety of voluntary measures, starting from help desk, multi-stakeholder initiatives, and public-private partnerships, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think I need to elaborate on that. And you might know we adopted a national action plan on business and human rights, accompanied with a very complex monitoring process to measure the due diligence performance of German businesses, all on a voluntary basis. So, and the results were honestly sobering. Less than 20% of the German businesses actually complied with their due diligence on a voluntary basis. So the consequences were very clear here in Germany, and we had a clear mandate from our chancellor to now work on a binding national due diligence act. And that's what we did in the past month and weeks. And luckily, we were able to present a draft due diligence law, which was approved by our cabinet beginning of March. And right now we're in the midst of a parliamentary debate on that. And also great to see Lucrezia here as well. The developments on EU level were very encouraging for us as well. And we're eagerly waiting for Commissioner Reinder's EU legislative proposal. So, and Germany will definitely actively engage in the process on EU level. But let me be clear on one thing here, Laura. A binding due diligence law alone won't solve the problems, the structural problems on the ground, predominantly in the producing countries. But it's imperative for a smart mix. And I want to be very clear on that as well. It sets the ground for transparency and the level playing field that businesses are actually asking us to do so. And this is most probably the main lessons learned for us in Germany. I've been in that field for more than 7 years, and this is most probably the main lessons learned. Voluntary measures alone failed to actually reach the whole market. And a lot of businesses asked us explicitly to act and set a legal framework, which is binding for all companies. So there is a clear necessity for mandatory measures. But a perfect smart mix covers therefore equally both mandatory and voluntary measures, and it requires, and that's an important fact for us too, an active participation of businesses as well as civil society, trade unions, and politics, of course. So our German National Action Plan, by the way, describes a number of smart mix measures, including measures to support companies in Germany. Among others, also the support for the Global Compact Network, Germany, which does, by the way, a terrific job in enabling the dialogue and cooperation between different stakeholders. And it provides great support for companies in Germany. I'm happy to have Thorsten here as well. And despite an upcoming legislation, we definitely need to continue supporting these voluntary measures. That's sort of mantra that we are repeating over and over for the past month and weeks. So, however, the current discussions have a clear focus on corporate due diligence, especially here in Germany. We shouldn't forget that the guiding principles are based on 3 pillars. So the state's duty to protect is equally important. So therefore, we should take a good look at government's own activities. And when I talk about that, definitely public procurement. And in Germany, this encompasses roughly 500 billion euros annually. This can be used as a leverage to promote responsible business activities. And I would like to finish off with an important challenge for us as development actors, which is impact on the ground. We must ensure that the implemented measures actually have an impact and improve the outcomes for rights holders. But I'm pretty sure we will pick up on this in today's discussion. Thank you.
Excellent, and there are indeed a couple of points in there already that I was intending to pick up on. So it's great to have something to build up on in that regard. Lucrezia, I would like to turn to you next, as we've already heard about the EU level and the plans of the Commission. Could you give us an update on DG Justice's plans with regard to mandatory human rights and environmental, as I understand, due diligence, and perhaps also share your view on what this means with regard to building a smart mix of measures to foster business respect for human rights?
Yes, thanks, Laura, and hello, everyone. Thanks also for inviting me, and I'm very happy to share with you a bit of our reflections of where we are now in the process. and of the work that we are doing on the upcoming initiative on sustainable corporate governance, which will include also a mandatory due diligence duty for companies. Probably it's best if I start by saying why we are doing this, and I will follow what also the reasoning that Nusha was saying before, in saying that in the last 10 years we achieved a lot in terms of commitments and engagement from companies, and also in terms of actions from states, and in Europe in particular from European member states. There were 11 that had action plans in place on human rights and business practices. There were some of them have enacted already legislation on mandatory due diligence duty. We think about the Netherlands, France. Some are discussing it. There was, Anusha mentioned before, the German proposal that is being discussed currently in the parliament. Other member states are discussing also whether to have further national legislation on this. And so there is a momentum and a debate that is going on in Europe, both at national level and at European level. And we could see it also at European level by the high participation and the high interest that the participants to our public consultation, the public consultation that we launched to prepare our initiative, have manifested. We received like 500,000 replies, many of which come from citizens, and many of which stress the importance of acting as a society together, both the private sector and the public sector, to make sure that our fundamental rights or values are upheld, as well as our commitments when it comes to the preservation of the environment. And this is a bit also the rationale of our initiative, building up of what was the idea behind the UNGPs of a complementarity between the private sector action and the action from the public sector. We are trying to involve also the private sector to a larger extent to what has been done today with a voluntary mechanism, and also to accompany them with guidance, and at the same time also to ensure a coherence between what we do as public sector. I'm thinking, for instance, to our development policy or our trade policy, and what we ask in this future initiative businesses also to do. So we should move together towards whole of a society approach involving both the businesses as well as public sector, towards an approach that that guarantees, that actually addresses the request of European citizens for respect of human rights, social rights, and taking care of the impact on the environment in the way in which we also produce and consume the different goods that we use in Europe. This is a bit the rationale. So we are working now on an initiative which is, as I was saying, building up on the national debates and initiatives that have already taken place, and has the aim at the same time to also, on the one hand, ensure a level playing field, avoid fragmentation, ensure more legal certainty, and at the same time also enlarge the pool of companies that would participate, because we need also to have a critical mass of companies to create an important change. The initiative will apply to companies across different sectors of our economy, taking into account, of course, because due diligence is a context-specific exercise, also the size of the companies, their economic weight, and the economic context in which they operate. It aims to be a proportionate initiative, and we are striving to make it to target in a way that it can be at the same time effective and proportionate, and also risk-based, taking into account the risk profile of the various companies. The aim, as I was saying, is to address risks of human rights violations, social rights violation, and adverse impacts on the environment. And as I was saying, we see this as complementary to other European policies. It's going to be a horizontal initiative that may be then complemented with sectoral initiative of either a legislative nature or of a non-legislative nature, or sometimes partnerships between the industry and the European institutions, like in the case, the discussions that are ongoing, for instance, in relation to a possible initiative on the cocoa sector. So that's all, and I'm happy to take further questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. There's a couple of points in there that I'm sure we'll pick up on later on with regard to coherence, sort of avoiding fragmentation. I think these are all very interesting and relevant points, as well as the effective and proportionate approach to this initiative. But first, let me turn to Frances. Now, you've obviously been closely following developments, especially at the EU level. Also, in light of what we heard now, I would be keen to know where you see progress towards a smart mix and why, as well as where you think there might still be gaps and challenges that we should be mindful of at the different levels, to the extent that you're able to speak to that.
Sure. Okay, thanks. So I think the first thing to say is that the introduction of a duty on companies in the EU or elsewhere and in member states to carry out mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence is absolutely in line with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And of course, the first principle sets out that states must take appropriate steps to prevent, investigate, punish, and redress human rights abuse by business through effective policies, legislation, regulations, and adjudication. And I think it's important to say that that state duty with regard to regulatory developments isn't a passive one of waiting to be kind of pressured to take action. It's in fact a proactive requirement. And that expectation of proactive review by the state of what's in place and what's missing on the regulatory side has probably not been sufficiently met by many of the national action plans, which have largely been a catalogue of existing measures rather than robust assessments of what more is needed. I think notably the German and the Dutch plans actually provided for assessing the uptake of human rights due diligence by business, as has been mentioned, and that was extremely useful, but perhaps not a common feature of many of the other NAPs. So coming squarely to the smart mix, what do we mean by that? Well, it's precisely about a mix of different types of measures, and so the state's duty necessarily involves legislative and regulatory measures in that mix, but it does mean looking at national, international, mandatory and voluntary measures, not just kind of the one or two that are the most convenient or already in place. So when it comes to talking about those state measures, we can discuss which measures can fall into which of those categories, but we do need to kind of think creatively to ensure that we've got effective measures in each of those categories and kind of move away from a binary yes/no debate over voluntary and mandatory approaches. But coming to the smart mix in relation specific to mandatory due diligence, I think the true purpose of a smart mix is that those different elements reinforce each other, right? So if we have mandatory human rights due diligence and environmental due diligence, which including civil liability for certain harms, and it's worth underlining that the guiding principles did foresee a role for liability in the likely evolution of the global standard of conduct into a legal standard of care. But if we have mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence and liability, then we need to think about what is being built around that to incentivize business to address human rights risks to the full extent of the value chain. And that's important because if you look at most of liability proposals, that they're narrower in scope. Okay, which does make sense, but then you don't want the perverse result where companies only do due diligence where they've got control or where they could be liable for harms that occur. And that would of course go against the logic of looking to prioritize the most severe risks to people, the salient human rights issues, regardless of where they sit in the value chain. So we do need kind of administrative measures that encourage companies to make progress on the full value chain, and we need accompanying policy measures like favoured access to public procurement, positive weighting of human rights criteria in relation to state financing and other forms of support that incentivise that deeper due diligence and engagement by businesses with the risks that they find.
Excellent. And now we talked a lot about businesses. Now let's hear from one. This is the moment where I would like to come to Thorsten. You've been working on these issues and following developments for a number of years. Would you agree with what you heard regarding progress, remaining challenges, potential ways to meet these challenges, or what do you think is most crucial now from your perspective to make the mix of measures that we already heard about a smart one?
Yeah, Laura, first of all, thank you for having me to bring in the business perspective. And yes, I agree to many things I've heard from Anusha, from Lucrezia, and from Francis. Also, I liked hearing that we need a kind of level playing field for sure. We need legal certainty for businesses. And we need, in my view, a as supranational as possible framework and not a kind of fragmented national one. And for sure, I mean, everybody familiar to the topic agrees to have a smart mix of voluntary initiatives and mandatory initiatives. I mean, the question is the pink elephant in the room. What does smart mean? I mean, so let me maybe from my perspective describe three kind of success factors making a mix smart. So the first would be we really need to understand the complexity. We are talking about supply chain, but to be honest, there are not really supply chains. They are more like supply nets, so networks. So very quickly after tier one, for instance, in my sector, the chemical industry, the chains very quickly become nets with spot markets and all the things. So it is not an underestimation that we need to understand this complexity. So that is really for a company like yourself, we have like more than 70,000 first-tier suppliers, and then you can multiply that. So complexity is not an excuse for companies to not do some things, but it is really something we need to understand. And that leads to another point. We need to organize the cooperation. So understand complexity, organize the cooperation between voluntary and between mandatory due diligence. So organize the cooperation between state and companies. And the third success criteria would be for me, a smart mix needs a smart dialogue, a smart discourse. So that means that we also need to engage in multi-stakeholder alliances. So complexity, it's, as I said, the nets is an important point. And what the challenge, because you asked of challenges, in many draft laws and laws I see, and I like the notion of having proportionate measures, but we also need to explain what proportionate means. So we need to make them tangible. We need to make them concrete for business to act on that. And so that brings me to another success criteria. We need to bring these voluntary and also mandatory due diligence on the level of branches, on sector initiatives. We need to have cross-sectorial and we need to have sectorial initiatives, because there we can take also the small and medium-sized enterprises with us. And therefore, this is a crucial thing for me to really have this sectorial level embedded and also have sectorial standards, for instance. Another thing would be very important for me, and that I also thought that Draghi wrote a letter to some governments, we need to keep the concept of salient risks. So it is an ask for me from businesses that we get from civil society, so to speak, a license to prioritize. So we need to focus on salient risk. There are many potential human rights harms, infringements, whatever, but we need to focus. Otherwise, we may oversee a salient thing because we are busy with many other things. And finally, we all know that even if a company does a due diligence according to UNGPs, according to OECD, according to maybe upcoming laws, we are sooner or later coming to limitations, to frontiers where a privately owned, so to speak, due diligence comes to a limit. And so that means for specifically in those countries who are not able or not willing to fulfill their first pillar, their duty to protect human rights, we need politically led initiatives accompanying private due diligence. So we can't not and we must not expect from even large companies what governments are not daring to do in other countries. So that is for me an important thing. And yeah, maybe really finally, I mean, let's think about what we're talking about. We need to come from confrontation to more cooperation. We need to develop these sectoral initiatives for sure in a multi-stakeholder level, not business alone, not government alone, not civil society alone. That maybe could bring us into discussion for a role the United Nations Global Compact and local networks could play. And so we never should forget that what we are talking about. We should not only talk about liabilities and think we are talking about I would say, one of the greatest social innovations of the last centuries, human rights. And so that is a call to work together.
Let me pick up on this directly, Torsten, and perhaps also stay with you for a second on that, because one thing obviously that that is quite crucial, not to lose sight of what essentially it is that we're talking about, right? And that's human rights, and that's ultimately the objective of human rights due diligence should ultimately be to generate positive outcome and change for rights holders. So I'd be interested. I mean, you've alluded to that already, but from your perspective, if the two or three key things to ensure that mandatory human rights due diligence enables or facilitates positive outcomes for rights holders along the value chain, rather than just becoming a tick box exercise, which I think was also something that some alluded to earlier already.
Okay, how to ensure that? You're asking me. Okay, yeah, I would say we need to translate those prescriptions in international standards and laws into practically feasible, and also I would say accepted proportionate measures for companies. And that also means that we should be careful not to instrumentalize human rights in just doing campaigning against companies. I sometimes have the feeling that companies who are more open, more stakeholder oriented and more dialogue oriented, sometimes more face the risk of being on the platform of a campaign. And so we might not underestimate that companies sometimes are more in the defense mode because they do not dare to talk that openly with their stakeholders about potential human rights issues along the value chain. And that needs to also be reflected in laws and regulations. And we also need to understand that sometimes I see that we are very quick in demanding you need then to stop the relation with your supplier or with your business partner. There are good reasons that I would say running away is really the ultima ratio, because I mean, sometimes it might be an easy thing, sometimes it might be not possible. And therefore, I mean, sometimes we can't expect from companies to leave the market in terms of due diligence, because that would also harm other responsibilities companies have in terms of jobs, in terms of taxes and other things. So as I said, translating these rather theoretical or vague for some specifically SMEs companies into practical tools, and therefore I'm calling for this branch or sectorial initiatives that I would say would make the difference to enable them to really do their due diligence.
Great. Couple of points there I picked up on, also the no cut and run, from confrontation to cooperation. Francis, I would like to move to you next with this question. How, in your view, can we ensure that the mandatory human rights due diligence frameworks that are being developed currently, or that we see an increasing momentum of, facilitate positive outcomes for rights holders? I think you alluded to some of that in your earlier statement when you talked about not just focusing on those areas where there's control, and not instead of not losing sight of other challenges and value chains that might be more difficult to tackle. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit more?
Well, I mean, I think it comes down to what quality human rights due diligence is, and whether we can you know, scale quality due diligence. If we get this right, you know, we can drive kind of better and more, or more and better quality human rights due diligence that prevents impacts occurring in the first place. You know, we can ensure that remedies provided as part of a company's internal processes when impacts do occur, and then of course when it's not, there is a new route to remedy for complainants as well. So I really think that, you know, key to those positive outcomes is ensuring that quality due diligence, and that means that a lot is hanging on ensuring that the whatever law is introduced reflects those international standards that exist under the guiding principles and OECD guidelines, and that regulators recognise that that assessing the quality of companies' due diligence and not just the presence of it is important. So, you know, when we're assessing a company's due diligence, the goal of due diligence will always be relevant. That is, that it's to prevent and address harm to people. So while due diligence is a standard of conduct, which means that just because there is a harm, it doesn't necessarily mean that the company's due diligence was inadequate. The outcomes of due diligence will be a relevant consideration in how we assess what was reasonable in all the circumstances. You know, and we've got to be explicit about these connections, or I think we'll end up with companies frustrated by wasted resources, and then this kind of stakeholders frustrated by a lack of measurable outcomes. And I think to you know, to Torsten's point on sort of cutting and running, well, I mean, that would not be viewed as a feature of quality due diligence, and it's absolutely not the sort of behavior and practice that we want to encourage in this law. You know, of course, it's a case of finding different ways to build and use leverage and lean into those problems and change behavior and practices on the ground.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Francis. And obviously, this is a question for policymakers, in a sense, though. So let's hear from them now. And I would start with Lucrezia this time. How, in your view, can we make binding legal frameworks, binding standards on due diligence effective? Although it's a standard of conduct, as we just heard, but also with regard to outcomes and impact, or perhaps what accompanying measures, we heard about incentives earlier, for instance, would make sense in this context, in your view.
Yes, indeed, I concur with the previous speakers in saying that it should be a focused exercise in order for it to be effective, that the companies should focus on the most salient risks of violations of human rights. Now, the issue there is that sometimes value chains are complex, and the most flagrant and the most salient risks of violations happen quite far away in the value chain. So there are difficulties for companies to identify them and address them. We are aware of that, and we are trying to design a system that would, on the one hand, make sure that the most salient risks are tackled, on the other hand, put something that is feasible for companies, and that the companies can use to address these risks, because after all, it's also in the interests of the companies themselves. Some do it already, and some have best practices that are already being used, and that we are also taking into account when reflecting on the possible solutions that we could include in our initiative. But the idea is this: having something that is effective, focuses on the biggest risks, thinking about like, for instance, risks of forced labor, worst form of child labor, unsafe working conditions. All of this preoccupies a lot the European public opinion, and which the European citizens have asked us to act. But at the same time, having something that the companies can concretely put in place. This also requires some reflecting on how to target the various obligations. but also requests on us also providing guidance and capacity building to the companies, especially when it comes, when we speak about smaller companies and SMEs, how to best involve them and how to best associate them to this general effort. And then we should think also about the enforcement mechanism that is effective. And we are thinking for the time being about a combination of an administrative enforcement mechanism together with a possible civil liability mechanism. And but I think it's also important, if we look at it from the company perspective, to make sure that also the due diligence duty is part of a more general exercise. It becomes part of a strategy of the company, a sustainable strategy of the company. And for this, to achieve this goal, we are also working together with the mandatory due diligence duty, also on another pillar of the initiative on sustainable corporate governance that could contain a clarification of directors' duties and would be aimed at involving directors and the management of the companies in the exercise to ensure also, and this is also what we hear from companies, that it is important that the highest level of management is involved into these efforts, and that it considers it a part of the entire strategy of the company.
So certainly when we talk about quality of human rights due diligence, that whole element of strategic integration is probably something that plays a key role. Thank you so much. Anusha, I think a couple of things were mentioned that actually you already mentioned in your introductory statement. So I'm happy to let you pick up on those, as obviously you also highlighted the point of impact on the ground, and not losing sight of that is important. What's your view on how to ensure it?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for my three speakers prior to me. I think I can strongly emphasize and underline what they were saying. And actually, when you were talking, I wrote down a couple of things that I would see as very effective and important. And I would summarize it into 5 elements, most probably. The ones you already mentioned, and I already mentioned, is the point of the impact on the ground. I think this is the most important factor, especially for a development actor, which comes together, of course, with the improvement of working conditions of rights holders. And the second most important thing for us is the inclusion of rights holders' perspective. Lucrezia was already referring to it, and that's what we are also referring to in draft due diligence law, is that this should be included in the risk management of the businesses, because severe human rights violations happen along the value chain. So, and the third very important thing was, which was somehow already mentioned, is the remedy and complaints mechanism, which is accessible to all potentially affected. This is something, it's a prime factor for us as well. And Lucrezia was already referring to it, and I would emphasize this is sanctions and in case of non-compliance, which requires a strong enforcement mechanism, of course. And the last thing is what Thorsten already was referring to, is the idea of translation, of accompanying measures. And this was actually the main finding of our national action plans monitoring, that a lot of businesses just don't understand what the requirements are, what is expected from them. And so our job as governmental actors is, on the one hand, to provide these guidances and to give advice to businesses. We have the help desk on business and human rights, which gives a very good hands-on advice to businesses in order to create an understanding of what is expected from them, what are these 5 core elements actually mean, how do I the risk management system, and so on and so forth. And of course, and this is part of the accompanying measures already said by the previous speakers, is of course to foster voluntary measures like the multi-stakeholder initiatives, like the UN Global Compact, which builds actually a platform for businesses. It's extremely important that businesses interact with each other, exchange views, and learn from each other, peer learning. How do you come up with your risk management? We're actually handling the same risks in the same sector. And Thorsten was already picking up on that with the sectoral focus. It's risk-based and sectoral focus. I think these are the main findings from our point of view.
Excellent. And I was actually going to ask all of you about the role that the United Nations Global Compact could play in this context, but I think we actually already answered that to a certain extent. Or certainly there were a lot of points in there that I think we can take away both as a local network and as a global initiative. So thank you very much for that. We're already running out of time, I have to say. So I would like to come to our closing remarks. This is probably one of those sessions where you'll raise more questions and points that you're actually able to answer, but I wouldn't say that that's a negative thing. So I realize there's so much more still to discuss, so I have to ask you to bear with me, to essentially ask you to sum it all up in a short answer to the following question, and that is, based on what we discussed, what, if you had to name one thing, what do you think will be most crucial in order to successfully design and implement a truly effective mix of measures on business and human rights? And now there's lots of adjectives in there that, you know, that are difficult to define and that probably merit more discussion. But if you could try to sort of sum it up in one answer, that would be awesome. And I'll look around and see who would like to go first on this one. Francis, go ahead, please.
Sure. I mean, it's the same point as I made before, but I think it's important. It's about capturing that quality human rights due diligence. So if the growing role of kind of a mandatory measures leads to a paper exercise, then really nobody in this equation benefits. So that makes kind of developing a shared view on what we consider quality due diligence essential, but that's both for mandatory and voluntary measures, right? And that has to connect back in reasonable ways to outcomes for people. And then of course I think that the talking to EU legislation, well, the EU is going to need to help harmonize interpretation, and national regulators are going to need support and guidance to evaluate what matters in terms of business conduct in relation to human rights, and not just what's easy to observe. So that's my key takeaway, I think.
Excellent. Who would like to go next with a short final answer?
I was about to say ladies first, but that was already broken by Francis. So yeah, maybe I go next. So,
go ahead.
Laura, I would say the currency of the success of due diligence in future is a coin with two sides. So we need to have this smart dialogue. So I would call it like a safe space. And that I would say the UN Global Compact is uniquely positioned to do that, because there we have government, we have civil society, and we have business to organize a safe space for discourse how the, let's say, mandatory and how the voluntary initiatives can go together. And the second coin I would call that we need to organize for specifically the broadness of companies, the SMEs, something what I would call maybe something like a safe harbor, specifically when liability comes into play. We need to give them a safe harbor where they say, okay, if I follow these guidelines, and we provide them currently with Chemistry by 3, a sectorial initiative with unions and associations in German and chemical industry, or with the Global Battery Alliance on the battery value chain, we need to have that as a safe harbor. So safe space, safe harbor together would be a safe currency for due diligence for me.
Great, excellent. All about the safety of it. Who would like to go next? Lucrezia or Anosha?
I can go. So I will
go ahead.
For what Thorsten was saying, that yes, indeed, it's important that we have a dialogue between the policymakers and the companies, and this dialogue should be throughout the preparation of the initiative of the policy and of the policy initiatives, on the implementation, and also in terms of guidance and capacity building. And also, finally, I would also like to stress that we have the same goal, which is not to sort of run away or abandon risky situations, but rather to together, and using both the strength that comes from the private sector and strength of the public policies, like not only in this field, but also more generally in development or trade, to make sure that we manage to improve to address the risk, mitigate the risks, and so to improve the conditions of living of people in the Union and in the world.
Excellent, and that leaves the last word to you, Anosha.
much, Laura. I think what I'm saying right now sounds very easy, but it's probably the most complex thing that we have to work on, is to create a constructive and conducive environment for exchange. This is what I can tell from the Partnership on Sustainable Textiles. It took us years to create that conducive environment. Thorsten was referring to it as a safe space. And I think mutual trust and active engagement, these are the two sides of the coins that I would like to mention, because we all know sustainability is nothing that comes overnight. So active engagement, and it's really hard work from all actors. And of course, there are requirements for businesses, but politics is asked, and also civil society, trade unions, and of course the consumers. That was a point that I would like to add. Especially when it comes to smart mix, we should not leave out the consumers as well. This is one point that should be added to the smart mix. And the last point is that due diligence should be understood as minimum requirements for companies. So it shall not keep companies away from going beyond compliance and promoting sustainability along their supply chains. That will be the most important finding for us to sort of support that. But I would definitely underline what the previous speakers already said. So we need a conducive environment where all actors come together and trust each other. I think trust needs time, and it needs the mutual understanding that we're working towards the same task.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for sharing your insights and perspectives today, and for helping us to answer some questions and to probably raise and discuss some important new ones that will merit some further attention. I think there's a lot of interesting points that we can take away. I just scribbled down words on my piece of paper here. I have cooperation, coherence, and the quality of human rights due diligence, and also certainty, which I think is an important point that was made. So, of course, I think the smart mix is still to some extent work in progress, but probably progress is the word that we should retain and be positive about, and also focus our attention on now. So thank you again to all of you, to all our panelists today, for being with us for this breakout session. Thank you all listening in and joining us from around the globe. I hope you enjoyed this session, and I hope that you will enjoy the rest of the UN Global Compact Leaders Summit. Goodbye.